Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 46 of the Push Podcast. This is the podcast for senior marketers who want to up their stakeholder management, listen to strategy talk, or simply feel seen. I'm your host, Jack Ferguson. I'm a brand consultant with over 15 years' experience in marketing across more than 20 industries. Today's episode is a solo episode which I do in between the fortnightly episodes that I co-host with other senior marketers. Today, I wanted to talk to you about the paradox of marketing objectives. So for me, objectives have always been useful and important because they help me prioritize what to do. They help me determine what to say no to, what to say yes to, etc., etc. So I set objectives to make the rest of the decision-making process a bit easier. So if a business that I was working with can afford to build its brand awareness for, say, 6 months versus a business that needs to make sales desperately this month, I would take very different approaches to that. Those businesses have different needs. Marketing's part of the business. Marketing contributes to the business needs. When the needs are different, objectives are different. Therefore, we need to do different stuff. But you probably already know all that. And in my experience, setting objectives doesn't always lead to a favourable outcome. So I'm going to talk about a story on this podcast episode. I was working with a professional services client some years ago. I remember doing some initial positioning work with him and we were getting along well. Great. He wanted some additional help and we worked towards a fractional CMO arrangement. Now, that was probably my first mistake, but that's a story for another day. So I negotiated an ongoing arrangement. We spoke about what I was going to do. We were off to the races. He'd told me early on that cash flow wasn't an immediate issue, but he'd like to have a growth machine that brings in leads consistently. And that's a common desire amongst clients or employers, as I'm sure you've experienced before. Consistent leads over time sound great. So I set some objectives with this client for the coming months. As it was professional services, I thought it'd be reasonable to expect we'd start getting our first sales in about 3 to 4 months' time after I'd started work. And that would give me some time to build some systems, build some consistency and therefore trust in the market, talk to some customers and do some other foundational work. So the objectives I set told me how long I could dedicate to building these systems. Long-term capability in the marketing department, brand, customer research, diagnostics, strategy, the list goes on. Makes sense, right? But in this case, 3 to 4 months rolled around and we hadn't made a sale. So the owner didn't seem too bothered by it initially. We talked about it, we talked about cash flow, and he said he was fine. Okay, all good. I kept moving forward. But another month rolled around and there was still no new sales and some tensions were starting to build. I could feel it. Not much was being said, but I could feel a change. A couple of projects he had been delayed and cash constraints were starting to appear. We ended up having an argument shortly after this time, and I remember that towards the end of that argument, he said to me, "You said we would have had sales 2 months ago. That was the plan." Here I could see my mistake. In my mind, that had been addressed the previous month. We'd talked it through. We talked about cash flow. Everything seemed good. And I did, in the moment, wonder why we were going back to this. But the reality is that when I set that expectation up front, I'd said that was the goal. And while I hadn't guaranteed anything, we all know non-marketers do tend to grip tightly to these type of conversations. So what do we do? What do we do as marketers? Because maybe we shouldn't set goals or objectives. But if we don't set objectives, how do we prioritize what to do? How do we balance the long term and the short term? And as we know, it always is a balance. So in this instance, if the objectives had been different, I would have started pushing harder on short-term tactics, for example. The tactics that I employ always follow the objectives that I set. So following this engagement, I then would always do short and long-term objectives with clients. So no matter what they said, I'd been burned too many times at this point. I just knew you have to do short-term as well, no matter what they say. So I started doing things like educating new clients about what getting a sale actually takes. For considered purchases, we know it takes brand building and the right offer, the right product, the right sales process at the right price, amongst other things. But as an older consultant, I've learned that this also isn't enough because when someone agrees to something in principle, they may not do their part to help with the sale. Their business circumstance may change, and we know that when things change and cash flow is tight, marketing gets blamed or cut. I don't do ongoing arrangements that aren't project-based for this exact reason anymore. But if I was still doing that, because marketers who have employers or who have long-term clients are in this situation, So what would I do if I was in that situation again? So from the get-go, I'd focus on short and long-term objectives still. So I'd still keep that, but I'd make them input-based rather than outcome-based. Short-term objectives might include to map out the sales process, the customer journey, but I'd ensure I'd set objectives that were within my control. If the business was chasing short-term sales, the objectives still would follow that, but they would look more like reach out to the existing email database one by one. Set the business up on job sites like Upwork or Expert 360. Reach out to existing contacts to see if they know anybody needing this business's services. For long-term brand building, I would flag objectives like identifying and prioritising category entry points, clarifying the brand position, establishing distinctive brand assets, executing customer research and defining what that actually is that I'd do, and also building a 12-month promotional plan. So these are all things that I would commit to because they are within my control, and they are objectives that have one eye on the short term and one eye on the long term. And if you're still wondering what happened with me and that client that I was talking about earlier in the episode, I did start getting some leads for him, but I think it was all a little bit too little, too late. So we parted ways not too long after that. Don't make the mistake I did, get those expectations nailed up front. Otherwise, and I'm sure you've already experienced this before, but it is hard to come back from. Thanks for listening along. Please subscribe so you get future episodes in your ears as soon as they drop every Tuesday. And if you are a marketer in need of some customer research or brand building help, please reach out to me on jack@jackferguson.co. Thank you, and until next time.